The Arizona desert holds many secrets, but perhaps none more remarkable than the story of Elizabeth Mason, a woman who stared death in the face when betrayed by her own blood, only to find salvation from the most unexpected source. This is a tale of survival against impossible odds, of courage in the face of abandonment, and of an unlikely bond that would forever change two souls from different worlds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sonoran Desert stretched before Elizabeth Mason like an endless sea of hostility, its red-gold sands shimmering under a merciless July sun. At 26, she stood alone, her slender frame casting a pitiful shadow as the dust from her half-brother's departing wagon dissolved into the heated air. The creak of wooden wheels, a sound that had accompanied her westward journey for weeks, faded into nothingness, leaving only the cruel whisper of wind through saguaro and the bitter taste of betrayal on her tongue. Vernon Mason, her half-brother, had driven away without so much as a backward glance, his final words seared into her memory like a brand. "This desert don't tolerate weakness, Lizzie. You've been nothing but dead weight since Tucson." Elizabeth's knees buckled beneath her, the rough canvas of her travel skirt offering scant protection as she collapsed onto the scorched earth. Her once auburn hair hung limp around her face, streaked with dust and sweat, framing eyes red from holding back tears she refused to shed. The water canteen at her feet, Vernon's parting gift, would sustain her for a day at most in this inferno. Her mind raced, struggling to comprehend the depth of her half-brother's cruelty. They had left St. Louis together 3 months ago. After her husband Thomas's death from tuberculosis, Vernon had promised a fresh start in California, a chance to rebuild her life away from grief and mounting debts. She had believed him, had trusted the only family she had left. That trust had led her here, to this barren place between nowhere and oblivion. "He planned this," she whispered, her voice strange and hollow in the vast emptiness. "All along. The signs had been there. Vernon's increasingly cold demeanor, his lingering glances at her wedding band, the only valuable thing she still possessed. The gold gleamed mockingly in the sunlight, a reminder of Thomas and a life that now seemed as distant as the eastern horizon. The temperature climbed steadily toward noon, heat radiating from the desert floor in visible waves. Elizabeth forced herself to her feet, swaying slightly as dizziness threatened to overwhelm her. She needed shelter before the worst heat of the day set in. Her eyes scanned the landscape, seeking anything that might offer respite from the sun's assault. To the north, the terrain rose into rocky foothills, dotted with palo verde and mesquite. To the south, the desert floor stretched unbroken, a death sentence for anyone foolish enough to venture across it on foot. East led back toward Tucson, at least 60 miles distant, an impossible journey with her limited water. West followed Vernon's trail toward California and the mining claim he had spoken of with increasing secrecy. "Think, Elizabeth," she commanded herself. Thomas had often praised her practical mind, her ability to stay clear-headed when others panicked. What would Thomas do? Thomas would head for water. In this desert, water was life. Elizabeth gathered what meager possessions Vernon had left her. The canteen, a small hunting knife in her boot that he'd overlooked, a packet of matches, and the shawl she'd been knitting during their journey west. She tucked her husband's worn pocket watch into her bodice, the metal warm against her skin. North, toward the foothills. Desert washes sometimes held water, especially in the shade of rock formations. If she could find water and shelter, she might survive long enough to what? Flag down another wagon, walk to the nearest settlement. She pushed the questions aside. Survival first, then rescue. The first steps were the hardest, each one carrying her further from the wagon's tracks, her last connection to civilization. The sands shifted beneath her impractical leather boots, designed for St. Louis parlors, rather than desert treks. Within minutes, sweat trickled down her back, soaking her cotton blouse. "Stupid, stupid woman," she muttered, anger at her own naivety, fueling each step. She had been so eager to escape her grief, to believe in Vernon's promises, that she'd ignored every warning sign. Vernon, who had always resented her mother's second marriage to his father. Vernon, who had hidden his resentment behind a mask of brotherly concern after Thomas's death. An hour into her journey north, the gravity of her situation settled over Elizabeth like a shroud. The canteen was already a quarter empty, each precious sip rationed against mounting thirst. Her fair skin, unaccustomed to such exposure, had begun to redden and blister despite the protection of her bonnet. The desert, indifferent to her plight, offered no relief. A sudden sound stopped her mid-stride, the distinctive warning rattle of a snake. Elizabeth froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she scanned the ground. The diamondback was coiled less than 2 feet away, its triangular head raised in threat. Slowly, with deliberate care, Elizabeth stepped backward. The snake watched, its rattle a constant reminder of the desert's many dangers. When she had retreated, a safe distance, she circled wide, giving the rattler a respectful berth before continuing northward. The encounter left her shaken, but also curiously alert. The desert was not just heat and thirst. It was alive with threats that required constant vigilance. Thomas had once told her that fear could be useful if it didn't lead to panic. She embraced the fear now, letting it sharpen her senses. By mid-afternoon, Elizabeth reached the edge of the foothills, where scattered boulders offered patches of shade. The respite from direct sunlight was immediate and profound. She sank down against a sun-warmed rock, allowing herself a slightly longer sip from the canteen. Her throat was parched, her lips beginning to crack. "I will not die here," she whispered, the declaration more prayer than statement. "I will not give Vernon the satisfaction." From her shaded vantage point, Elizabeth surveyed the terrain she had crossed. The wagon's dust had long since settled, erasing all visible evidence of her abandonment. The desert stretched vast and impassive, its beauty as terrible as its dangers. In Philadelphia, where she had grown up, nature had seemed tamed, contained, within parks and gardens. Here, it ruled with absolute authority. Elizabeth's attention caught on a thin line of darker green winding through the foothills about a half-mile distant. Years of listening to Thomas's mining stories had taught her to recognize the signs of water from afar. That ribbon of vegetation might indicate a seasonal wash, perhaps even a spring. Hope renewed her strength. She stood, adjusting her bonnet and tying her shawl across her shoulders for added protection from the sun. The distance seemed manageable now that she had a clear destination. The terrain grew more challenging as she climbed, loose screes sliding beneath her feet. Twice she nearly fell, catching herself against sharp rocks that scraped her palms. But the greenery grew more distinct with each step, cottonwoods mixed with desert willows, their presence a near guarantee of water. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape when Elizabeth finally reached the wash. To her immense relief, a small spring bubbled from between rocks, creating a shallow pool before continuing downhill as a trickle that eventually disappeared into the thirsty earth. "Thank God," she breathed, resisting the urge to plunge her face directly into the pool. Thomas had warned against drinking too quickly when dehydrated. Instead, she cupped water in her hands, sipping slowly, letting her body adjust. The water was cool and tasted faintly of minerals, the most exquisite thing she had ever experienced. After quenching her thirst and refilling the canteen, Elizabeth assessed her surroundings more thoroughly. The wash offered natural shelter, with rocky overhangs and dense vegetation that could conceal her from both the elements and any passing threats. More importantly, it provided a sustainable water source. As darkness approached, temperatures plummeted, the desert's second deadly extreme. Elizabeth gathered what dry brush she could find, building a small fire beneath an overhang where the smoke would disperse against the rock. The flames provided much-needed warmth and a sense of security against the desert night. She laid her shawl on the ground, creating a thin barrier between her body and the cooling earth. Exhaustion overwhelmed her as the day's events caught up with her body. Vernon's betrayal, the desperate trek north, the constant threat of death, it all crashed down at once, drawing forth tears she could no longer contain. "Pull yourself together," she scolded, wiping her face. "Tears won't get you to safety." The night brought new sounds. The distant howl of coyotes, the soft hooting of an owl, the rustle of nocturnal creatures among the rocks. Elizabeth kept the fire burning, adding fuel, sparingly to make her limited resources last. Sleep came in fitful bursts, her body too alert to danger for true rest. Dawn arrived in a spectacular blaze of color, the sky painted in shades of crimson and gold that gradually gave way to harsh blue. Elizabeth stirred, her body stiff from the uncomfortable night. Her situation remained dire, but the immediate threat of death had receded. She had water, fire, and rudimentary shelter, enough to sustain her while she planned her next move. After a small breakfast of prickly pear fruit she had gathered the previous evening, Elizabeth took stock of her resources. The knife could serve as a tool for harvesting more desert plants or fashioning additional tools. Her shawl provided warmth and could be unwound for cordage if necessary. The matches were precious, to be conserved at all costs. What she lacked was any substantial food source or means of signaling for help. Without either, her survival remained precarious at best. "One problem at a time," she murmured, remembering Thomas's approach to the mine's challenges. "Focus on what you can solve today." Today's problem was food. Water would sustain her for a time, but without nourishment, her strength would fail. Elizabeth had never hunted, but she had prepared a game that Thomas brought home. She understood the basic principles. The wash would attract animals seeking water. If she could set a trap, she might catch something small. Using her knife and strips from the hem of her skirt, Elizabeth fashioned a simple snare, setting it near a game trail she had identified leading to the water. The process was frustrating, requiring several attempts before she felt confident in the design. Whether it would work remained to be seen. Midday brought oppressive heat once more. Elizabeth retreated to the deepest shade she could find, conserving her energy and sipping water sparingly. Her thoughts turned to Vernon, wondering if he felt any remorse for abandoning her. She doubted it. The coldness in his eyes when he told her to get down from the wagon had contained no hint of humanity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You'll see, Vernon," she promised the empty desert. "I'm stronger than you know." As the afternoon waned, Elizabeth checked her snare, finding it empty but undisturbed. Patience, she reminded herself. Even if she caught nothing today, she could survive on desert plants for a while longer. She had identified several edible species from her limited knowledge: prickly pear, mesquite pods, and what appeared to be wild onions growing near the spring. Her third day in the desert dawned with a change in the air, a heaviness that promised rare summer rain. Elizabeth welcomed the prospect, knowing that water from the sky would supplement her spring and possibly drive game into the open. She spent the morning improvising a container from large prickly pear pads, carefully removing the spines and shaping them into a rough bowl that might catch rainfall. The storm arrived with sudden violence, lightning splitting the sky and thunder echoing through the hills. Rain fell in heavy sheets, transforming the dry wash into a surging stream within minutes. Elizabeth scrambled to higher ground, watching in awe as the desert transformed before her eyes. The downpour lasted less than an hour, but it changed everything. The wash ran brown with soil and debris carried from higher elevations. New plants seemed to spring up before her eyes as dormant seeds responded to moisture. The desert, so recently an enemy, suddenly offered abundance. In the storm's aftermath, Elizabeth's snare finally yielded results. A desert cottontail, caught as it fled the rising water. The rabbit's death brought a complex mixture of triumph and regret. She had never taken a life before, but necessity overcame sentiment. With methodical precision, she cleaned and prepared the animal as she had done countless times in her kitchen back east. That night, she ate her first substantial meal since Vernon's abandonment. The meat, roasted over her fire, restored energy she hadn't realized was missing. With food in her stomach and rain-freshened air in her lungs, Elizabeth began to believe she might actually survive. It was during that moment of renewed hope that she first sensed she was being watched. The feeling came without warning, a prickling awareness that raised the fine hairs on her arms. Elizabeth froze, the rabbit bone in her hand momentarily forgotten as her eyes searched the darkness beyond her fire's glow. She saw nothing, but the sensation persisted. "Hello?" she called, her voice sounding small against the vastness. "Is someone there?" Only the night sounds answered. The crackle of her fire, the drip of residual rainwater from rocks, the distant call of a night bird. Yet she remained certain she was not alone. Elizabeth added wood to her fire, building it higher than was strictly necessary. The flames jumped, pushing back the darkness and providing a psychological barrier against whatever or whoever lurked beyond. She gripped her small knife, its blade reflecting firelight. Sleep was impossible now. Elizabeth sat with her back against the stone, watching and listening as hours crawled by. Occasionally she thought she glimpsed movement, a shadow shifting against deeper shadow, the brief reflection of light where no eyes should be. Each time she strained to confirm what she'd seen, but found nothing definitive. By dawn, exhaustion had overtaken fear. Elizabeth's eyes burned from smoke and lack of sleep. Her body slumped against the rock. The night had passed without incident, yet she remained convinced of an unseen presence. As morning light filtered through the desert canopy, Elizabeth made a discovery that confirmed her suspicions. At the edge of her camp, pressed into mud left by the storm, was a single footprint, not her own. This print was larger, made by a moccasin rather than her leather boot. More tellingly, it faced inward, toward her camp, rather than away. Someone had indeed been watching her, standing motionless in the darkness for long enough to leave an impression in drying mud. The realization sent a chill through Elizabeth, despite the rapidly warming air. The footprint belonged to a man, an Apache, if she correctly identified the distinctive pattern worked into the soul. Elizabeth had heard stories about the Apache, since crossing into the territory most designed to frighten Eastern travelers. They were described as fierce warriors who considered this desert their ancestral homeland, who resisted white encroachment with deadly efficiency. Had he been watching to determine if she was a threat, planning to attack once she lowered her guard? Or was there some other purpose to his silent observation? Whatever his intentions, Elizabeth knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer alone in her struggle for survival. Whether this unseen watcher would prove to be her salvation or her doom remained to be seen. As the sun climbed higher, Elizabeth made a decision born of desperation and defiance. She would not cower or flee. If the Apache returned, she would face him directly. She had already confronted betrayal and the desert's deadly embrace. She would meet this new challenge with the same determination. "I survived Vernon," she whispered to herself, running a finger along the edge of the footprint. "I survived the desert. I'll survive you too, whoever you are." With renewed purpose, Elizabeth tended her fire, prepared her meager supplies, and waited for nightfall to bring her watcher back from the shadows. The game of patience had begun. Dawn's first light revealed what darkness had concealed. A man standing at the edge of Elizabeth's camp, motionless as the desert itself. He materialized, like an apparition, though Elizabeth knew he must have approached while she dozed against the rock wall. Her hand instinctively tightened around her knife, though the blade seemed pitifully inadequate against this visitor. The Apache stood well over 6 feet, his copper skin weathered by sun and wind. Black hair fell past his shoulders, secured with a simple band of woven material. He wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt, both well-worn but meticulously maintained. A knife hung at his waist and a rifle was slung across his back, weapons that made her own seem like a child's toy. Most striking were his eyes, dark and unfathomable, revealing nothing of his thoughts as they assessed her from across the dying. Embers of her fire, Elizabeth forced herself to meet his gaze, fighting the urge to look away. If death had come for her, she would face it with dignity. Neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Elizabeth's mind raced through her limited options. Running was futile. He would catch her within moments. Fighting was equally pointless, given his obvious strength and superior weaponry. That left only one path: communication. "Good morning," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. The absurd formality of her greeting in this wilderness setting almost made her laugh despite her fear. The Apache's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise at her composure. He made no move to approach closer or to reach for his weapons, which Elizabeth took as encouraging signs. "Do you speak English?" she asked, slowly rising to her feet. Her legs protested after the long night, but she refused to remain in a position of vulnerability. The man studied her for several moments longer before offering a single curt nod. "Some." His voice was deep, the word accented but clear. Relief washed through Elizabeth. Communication might be difficult, but not impossible. She gestured to what remained of her fire. "Would you like to sit? I have water to share." Again, that flicker in his otherwise impassive gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. He seemed to weigh her offer against some internal calculation before stepping forward with the silent grace of a predator. He lowered himself to a rock opposite her, the fire pit between them serving as both barrier and shared space. Elizabeth retrieved her canteen, taking a small sip before offering it to him, a gesture to show it wasn't poisoned. He accepted with a barely perceptible nod, drinking sparingly before returning it. "I am Elizabeth Mason," she said, placing a hand over her heart. "Elizabeth. Elizabeth," he repeated, pronouncing each syllable with careful precision. He touched his own chest. "Nahilzai." "Nahilzai," she echoed, knowing she didn't quite capture the proper inflection. "It's good to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." His brow furrowed slightly, perhaps at her phrasing or her attempt at social niceties in this desolate place. "Why are you here?" he asked, gesturing to the wash and the desert beyond. No white woman travels alone. The question cut to the heart. Of her predicament, Elizabeth considered how to explain Vernon's betrayal in simple terms. "My brother," she began, unsure how to convey familial relationships across the language barrier, "brought me here, then left me. He drove away." She mimicked the motion of a wagon departing, "left me to die." Nahilzai's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Why?" "Money," Elizabeth said bitterly, touching her wedding ring. "And this, I think, it was my husband's. My husband died, and my brother promised to take me to California, but he never meant to. He wanted this." Understanding dawned on Nahilzai's expression. "Greed," he said, the English word clear and weighted with contempt. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "Greed." Nahilzai gazed past her toward the horizon, his thoughts unreadable. When he looked back, there was an intensity to his scrutiny that made Elizabeth feel transparent, as though he could see beyond her words to the truth of her character. "You survived 3 sons," he stated. "Most whites would be dead." It wasn't a compliment but an observation, yet Elizabeth felt a small surge of pride nonetheless. "I found water," she said simply, "made fire, set snares." He nodded once, acknowledging her efforts. Good skills, not enough. The brutal honesty stung, but Elizabeth couldn't argue. Her improvised survival techniques had bought her time. Nothing more. Without intervention, she would eventually succumb to starvation, exposure, or one of the desert's many predators. "Will you help me?" she asked directly, seeing no benefit in prevarication. "I need to reach a settlement. Tucson, or—" "Why should I help?" Nahilzai interrupted, his tone not unkind, but pragmatic. "White people bring trouble. Soldiers, miners, take Apache land." Elizabeth hesitated. The question was fair, and she had no ready answer beyond her own desire to live. What could she possibly offer this man in exchange for her survival? "I don't know," she finally admitted. "I can't promise you anything of value, but I'm not a soldier or a miner. I'm just lost." Something in her candor seemed to register with Nahilzai. He studied her for a long moment, then stood abruptly. "Wait, here," he instructed before disappearing into the desert scrub with silent efficiency. Elizabeth remained by the fire, uncertain whether his departure was temporary or permanent. Had she offended him with her honesty, or was he simply abandoning her to her fate, having satisfied his curiosity about the strange white woman alone in the desert? The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying as morning gave way to midday. Elizabeth conserved her energy, retreating to shade and sipping water sparingly. She tried not to dwell on Nahilzai's disappearance, focusing instead on practical matters, gathering more edible plants, checking her snares, planning for another night alone. It was mid-afternoon when he returned, materializing from the landscape, as suddenly as he had vanished. In his hands he carried a desert hare, already dressed for cooking, and a pouch that hung heavily at his side. Without ceremony, he rekindled her dying fire, adding dry brush to produce a hotter flame. Using sticks as skewers, he positioned the hare over the heat, the meat sizzling as fat dripped into the flames. "You eat," he said. Not a question, but a directive. Elizabeth watched as he prepared the meal with efficient movements that spoke of years of practice. There was something mesmerizing about his economy of motion, the way he wasted no energy or resources. "Thank you," she said, as he handed her a portion of the cooked meat. The rich aroma made her stomach clench with hunger she hadn't fully acknowledged. They ate in silence, the shared meal creating a tentative connection across the cultural void between them. When they had finished, Nahilzai opened his pouch and withdrew several items: a small clay container, a bundle of herbs, and a pair of moccasins made from soft hide. "4 feet," he said, indicating the moccasins and then pointing to her inappropriate boots. "Leather is too hard. Make blisters." Elizabeth accepted the footwear with surprise. "You made these?" "Found," he corrected. "Apache camp nearby. These belonged to one who walked to the spirit world, no longer needed." A shiver ran through Elizabeth at the thought of wearing a dead person's shoes. But practicality overrode superstition. Her boots were indeed causing painful blisters that would only worsen with travel. "And this?" she asked, gesturing to the clay pot. "For skin," Nahilzai indicated her sunburned face and hands. Aloe, yucca, stops burning. The unexpected consideration. Behind these gifts confused Elizabeth. Why would this man, a stranger from a people supposedly hostile to settlers, show such care for her well-being? "Why are you helping me?" she asked, echoing his earlier question to her. Nahilzai's expression remained inscrutable. "Apache way. Desert decides who lives, who dies, not men." He paused, seeming to search for words. "You fight to live. Desert respects this. I respect this." The simplicity of his answer humbled Elizabeth. To be judged solely on one's will to survive rather than on birth, wealth, or social standing, there was a raw honesty to it that appealed to her. "What now?" she asked, applying the cooling salve to her burned skin. "Rest," he replied. "Tomorrow we will walk." "To where?" "Small trading post, 2 days north. White people there can help you reach Tucson." Elizabeth felt a surge of hope at this concrete plan. "You'll guide me there?" Nahilzai nodded once. "Yes, but we travel Apache way, silent, alert. You follow my lead or stay here." "I'll follow," she promised without hesitation. "I'll do whatever you say." A ghost of amusement crossed his stoic features. "We will see." As dusk approached, Nahilzai instructed Elizabeth in preparing for their journey. The lessons were delivered with terse efficiency: how to conserve water by traveling at dawn and dusk, how to move silently across desert terrain, how to recognize landmarks that would guide them north. "Sleep now," he advised as darkness fell. "Leave before sun." Elizabeth settled onto her makeshift bed, watching as Nahilzai positioned himself at the edge of camp, his back against a boulder, rifle across his knees. He would keep watch, she realized. Another unexpected kindness. "Nahilzai," she said softly, "thank you." He acknowledged her gratitude with the barest inclination of his head, his attention already fixed on the surrounding darkness. Elizabeth closed her eyes, experiencing her first true sense of security since Vernon's betrayal. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she would face it with an ally rather than alone. Dawn had not yet broken when Nahilzai roused her with a light touch on her shoulder. Elizabeth woke instantly, momentarily disoriented before remembering the previous day's events. "Time," he said simply. Elizabeth donned the moccasins, marveling at their comfort compared to her boots, which she reluctantly abandoned. She packed her few possessions, the canteen, knife, and Thomas's watch, while Nahilzai extinguished all evidence of their fire. "Leave no sign," he instructed, smoothing dirt over the fire pit. "Bad men may follow." The mention of potential pursuit sent a chill through Elizabeth. "My brother, or others, desert has many eyes." They set off in the grey light preceding sunrise, Nahilzai setting a pace that was challenging but sustainable. Elizabeth struggled initially to match his silent movement across the terrain, her city-bred clumsiness a stark contrast to his fluid grace. Each time she stumbled or dislodged a stone, he paused, his expression unreadable but his message clear. Such noise could attract unwanted attention. By mid-morning, Elizabeth's muscles burned with exertion, but she refused to complain. The desert was awakening around them, revealing its harsh beauty in the full light of day. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels, their pleated trunks housing entire ecosystems. Lizards darted between rocks, their movements quick and deliberate. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding thermals with effortless majesty. When they paused in the shade of a rocky outcropping, Elizabeth found herself captivated by a tiny desert blossom pushing through seemingly barren soil. The delicate and purple petals seemed impossibly vibrant against the monochrome landscape. "Beautiful," she murmured, kneeling for a closer look. Nahilzai followed her gaze. "Mariposa lily," he said, "comes after rain, lives 1 day, maybe 2, then gone." "So brief," Elizabeth mused, "but perfect he replied, surprising her with this philosophical observation. Beauty does not need long life to matter. As they continued their journey, Elizabeth began to observe Nahilzai more closely. Despite his imposing presence, there was a serenity to his interaction with the landscape. He moved through it as an integral component rather than an intruder. He paused occasionally to examine tracks in the sand or to note the flight pattern of birds, reading the desert's language with fluency, born of lifelong immersion. Near midday, when the heat became unbearable, they took shelter in a shallow cave. Nahilzai produced dried berries from his pouch, sharing them wordlessly. Elizabeth accepted, savoring the tart sweetness that cut through her thirst. "Have you always lived in the desert?" she asked, breaking the companionable silence. Nahilzai considered the question, perhaps weighing how much of himself to reveal. "My people have been here since before memory," he said finally. "I have walked other lands, but always return." "What other lands?" Elizabeth pressed, curious about this glimpse into his past. A shadow crossed his features. "Army school, 3 winters. They tried to make me not Apache." The admission startled Elizabeth. She had heard of Indian schools established by the government, designed to civilize native children by stripping away their culture, language, and traditions. The thought of the proud man before her subjected to such treatment filled her with unexpected indignation. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate but sincere. He shrugged, dismissing her sympathy. "I learned English, learned white ways, useful, knowledge for changing times." His pragmatism impressed Elizabeth. Rather than allowing bitterness to consume him, he had extracted value from a painful experience, turning it to his advantage. "Is that why you're helping me? Because you understand?" "White ways?" Nahilzai's gaze sharpened. "I help because I choose to, not because school made me think like white man." Elizabeth flushed, recognizing her unintentional insult. "I didn't mean—" "I know," he interrupted, his tone softening slightly. "White. People see only white reasons." He tapped his chest. "Apache reasons are different." The gentle rebuke silenced Elizabeth. She had indeed been projecting her own cultural assumptions onto his actions, unable to conceive of motivations outside her framework of understanding. "Teach me," she said impulsively, "about Apache reasons." Something flickered in Nahilzai's eyes, surprise perhaps or approval. "First lesson," he said, rising to his feet. "Listen more than speak." As they resumed their journey, Elizabeth took his instruction to heart, focusing on observation rather than conversation. She noticed how Nahilzai chose each step with deliberation, minimizing his impact on the environment, how he acknowledged animal signs with subtle gestures of respect, how he oriented himself not by the sun alone, but by a complex interplay of landmarks, vegetation, and wind patterns. By late afternoon, they had covered significant ground, the terrain gradually shifting from open desert to more varied topography. Nahilzai led them along a path invisible to Elizabeth's untrained eye, occasionally pausing to ensure she followed safely. During one such pause, he suddenly tensed, raising a hand to signal silence. Elizabeth froze, heart racing as she strained to identify what had triggered his alarm. The desert seemed peaceful. The only sound was the whisper of wind through creosote bushes. Nahilzai pointed to the ground, where recent hoofprints disturbed the sand. "Horses," he murmured. "3, maybe 4, moving north. Is that unusual?" Elizabeth whispered. "Apache don't use this path. Too exposed." His eyes scanned the horizon. White men. Looking for something. The implication was clear. They might be looking for her. Whether Vernon had returned with reinforcements or an unrelated party was searching the desert. The presence of mounted men represented a potential threat. "What do we do?" Elizabeth asked, fighting a rising panic. Nahilzai considered their options, his expression grave. "Change route. Go west, then north. Longer, but safer." The detour added hours to their journey, forcing them to traverse more challenging terrain. Elizabeth struggled over rocky inclines, her muscles protesting and her newly acquired moccasins offering limited protection against sharp stones. Yet she pushed forward, without complaint, drawing strength from Nahilzai's unwavering pace. When they finally made camp as darkness fell, Elizabeth was exhausted beyond measure. They had found another small spring, its water brackish but drinkable. Nahilzai forbade a fire, concerned it might attract attention, so they ate dried meat and cactus fruit in the growing darkness. "Rest now," he advised, seeing her fatigue. "Tomorrow is harder." Elizabeth settled onto the hard ground, using her arm as a pillow. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. The day's events swirled in her mind. The hoofprints, the detour, the glimpses into Nahilzai's past. Most of all, she pondered the strange twist of fate that had brought her an unlikely protector in this wilderness. "Nahilzai," she whispered, unsure if he was awake. "Sleep," came his immediate response from the darkness. "Just one question," she persisted. "Why were you watching me before you showed yourself?" The silence stretched so long, she thought he might not answer. Finally, his voice drifted softly across the camp, "To see if you were worth saving." The simple honesty of his reply left Elizabeth speechless. In those few words lay a profound truth. He had judged her, not by her race or gender or social standing, but by her actions in the face of abandonment, by her will to survive against overwhelming odds. As sleep finally claimed her, Elizabeth realized that in this harsh desert, she had found something unexpected, the most honest assessment of her character she had ever received. Nahilzai had seen her at her most vulnerable and desperate, stripped of all pretense and social niceties, and somehow, incredibly, he had deemed her worthy of his aid. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, that knowledge was enough. Elizabeth woke to Nahilzai's hand on her shoulder, the sky still dark overhead. Stars blazed with cold brilliance across the heavens, the Milky Way, a silver river cutting through the blackness. She rose without protest, her body stiff from the hard ground, but her mind alert. The previous day's journey had taught her the value of moving before dawn, when the desert's merciless heat still slumbered. "Riders nearby," Nahilzai whispered, his voice barely audible. "We move now." The urgency in his tone dispelled any lingering drowsiness. Elizabeth gathered her meager possessions with practiced efficiency, securing Thomas's watch in her bodice and tying her canteen to her belt. No words were needed as they slipped away from their resting place, Nahilzai leading them along an invisible path through boulder-strewn terrain. The first hint of dawn brightened the eastern horizon as they created a ridge, painting the landscape in shades of purple and indigo. Nahilzai paused, crouching low, and gestured for Elizabeth to do the same. From this vantage point, they could see across a vast expanse of desert basin. In the distance, perhaps a mile away, tiny figures on horseback moved across the terrain, their silhouettes dark against the lightening sky. 4 men, Nahilzai observed, his keen eyesight discerning details Elizabeth could barely perceive. One tracks, others follow. "Is it Vernon?" Elizabeth asked, squinting at the distant riders. "Cannot tell, but they search with purpose." The knowledge that they were being actively hunted sent a chill through Elizabeth, despite the growing warmth of the day. "What do they want with me?" she whispered. Though she already suspected the answer, Nahilzai's expression was grim. "Gold," he said simply, gesturing to her wedding ring. "Or revenge for damaged pride. Men like that need no good reason." Elizabeth twisted the gold band on her finger, the metal warm against her skin. Thomas had saved for months to buy it, working double shifts at the silver mine in Colorado where they'd first met. It represented everything he'd been, steadfast, generous, determined. The thought of surrendering it to Vernon or his hired men was unbearable. "Can we still reach the trading post?" she asked. Nahilzai considered, his eyes tracking the rider's progress. "Yes, but not a direct path. Must go through Dripping Springs Canyon. Difficult terrain for horses." "And for people?" Elizabeth asked wryly, already anticipating the challenge. The ghost of a smile touched Nahilzai's lips. "For city woman, yes. Very difficult." The hint of humor, so unexpected from her stoic guide, lightened Elizabeth's spirits momentarily. "Then it's fortunate I'm not a city woman anymore," she replied, straightening her shoulders. "I'm becoming a desert woman." Nahilzai studied her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to assess not just her words, but the truth behind them. "Perhaps," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "We will see." They descended from the ridge on its far side, using the elevation as a shield between themselves and the distant riders. The terrain changed as they moved west, becoming more rugged and broken. Massive rock formations thrust upward from the earth, their surfaces sculpted by eons of wind and infrequent rain into fantastic shapes. Elizabeth marveled at nature's artistry, even as she struggled to keep pace with Nahilzai. The Apache moved with the confidence of intimate familiarity, navigating a labyrinthine path through narrowing corridors of stone. By mid-morning, they entered what must be Dripping Springs Canyon, a deep cleft in the earth where sheer walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, meeting a narrow strip of sky above. "Water here," Nahilzai said, pausing beside a rock face where moisture seeped from a nearly invisible crack, gathering in a small, clear pool before continuing downward as a glistening thread. "Drink. Fill the canteen." Elizabeth did as instructed, savoring the sweet coolness. The water tasted of minerals, clean and revitalizing. She watched as Nahilzai performed a brief gesture before drinking, a small movement of his hand that seemed almost like a blessing or acknowledgement. "What did you do?" she asked, "before you drank?" Nahilzai considered her question, perhaps deciding whether to explain. "Thanks to Earth Mother," he said finally, "for water's gift." "Like a prayer?" Elizabeth suggested, thinking of her own childhood rituals of mealtime grace. "Not prayer. Recognition." He searched for words to bridge their different worldviews. Apache SeaWorld is connected. Water, stone, plants, animals, all related. When we take, we acknowledge. Elizabeth pondered this perspective as they continued through the canyon. Her own upbringing had emphasized humanity's dominion over nature, resources to be used rather than relatives to be respected. Yet in this harsh environment, where survival hinged on understanding the desert's rhythms, Nahilzai's philosophy made profound sense. The canyon narrowed further, the path occasionally requiring them to squeeze sideways through tight passages between towering walls. The way would indeed be impassable for horses, perhaps even for men less familiar with its secrets than Nahilzai. Elizabeth found herself increasingly grateful for her guide's knowledge, recognizing that without him she would have perished. Days ago, her bones eventually joining the sun-bleached remains they occasionally passed. "How did you learn this path?" she asked, during a brief rest. "It seems impossible to discover." "My father showed me," Nahilzai replied, a rare reference to his personal history. His father showed him. Knowledge passes down season to season. "Like stories," Elizabeth suggested, thinking of the tales her mother had shared, narratives that connected generations. Nahilzai nodded. "Stories in land, in sky, in water, for those who learn to read them." As they ventured deeper into the canyon, Elizabeth noticed crude drawings on the stone walls, figures of animals, geometric patterns, handprints in ochre and white. "Who made these?" she asked, reaching out but not touching the ancient artwork. "The old ones," Nahilzai replied, his voice taking on a subtle reverence. People before Apache, before Navajo, long vanished. Elizabeth studied the pictographs, recognizing deer, snakes, and what appeared to be rain clouds. Despite their apparent simplicity, the images conveyed a powerful connection to this landscape and its inhabitants. "They're beautiful," she murmured. "Beautiful." Yes, also words. Nahilzai indicated a sequence of symbols. This tells where to find water in the dry season. This warns of mountain lion territory. Ancient map for those who understand. The idea that these images served practical as well as aesthetic purposes fascinated Elizabeth. How different from the purely decorative art that adorned Philadelphia. "Parlors, divorced from any survival function. Could you teach me to read them?" she asked impulsively. Nahilzai gave her a measuring look. "Takes a lifetime," he said not unkindly. "But small lessons, perhaps, if you listen well." They resumed their journey, the canyon occasionally widening into grottos where unlikely greenery flourished around seeps and springs. In one such oasis they paused to eat, prickly pear fruit and what Nahilzai called desert chia seeds, small, black specks that expanded when moistened, providing surprising nourishment. The relative abundance of water in the canyon supported more wildlife than Elizabeth had seen elsewhere in the desert. Lizards skittered across stone, birds nested in crevices high overhead, and once, startlingly, a bighorn sheep observed them from a nearly inaccessible ledge before bounding away with impossible agility. "Everything adapted," Nahilzai remarked, noting her fascination with the desert creatures. "Desert does not reward weakness, but honors strength that fits its ways." Elizabeth considered his words, recognizing their application to her own situation. She had entered the desert woefully unprepared, a creature from another environment thrust into an unforgiving realm. Like the transplanted roses that had withered in her garden back home, she was not naturally suited to this harsh landscape. Yet unlike those roses, she was capable of adaptation, learning, observing, changing. "I'm trying to adapt," she said, more to herself than to Nahilzai. He heard nonetheless. "Yes," he agreed. "This is why you still breathe when others would be dust." The canyon began to ascend gradually, the path becoming steeper. Elizabeth's legs burned with the effort, but she welcomed the physical challenge as a distraction from darker thoughts. The sun reached its zenith, its heat somewhat mitigated by the canyon walls, but still formidable. Sweat soaked her clothing, and her newly acquired moccasins, while more comfortable than her abandoned boots, offered minimal protection against the rocky terrain. By mid-afternoon, the character of the canyon changed again, broadening into a high-walled valley where stunted junipers grew in the shadow of towering cliffs. Nahilzai paused suddenly, crouching to examine the ground. His expression, typically so controlled, revealed momentary concern. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, instantly alert to the shift in his demeanor. "Tracks," he replied, indicating marks she would have overlooked entirely. "Apache, not from my band." "Are they dangerous?" The question seemed naive even as she asked it. Nahilzai straightened slowly. "All men can be dangerous when threatened. These Apache, White Mountain Band, sometimes peaceful with whites, sometimes not. Depends on how whites treat them. And how do they feel about Apache who help whites?" Elizabeth asked, the implication clear. Nahilzai met her gaze directly. "Depends on the white, depends on the Apache." His hand moved subtly toward his knife, a gesture so slight she nearly missed it. "Stay close. Speak only if spoken to." They proceeded more cautiously, Nahilzai scanning their surroundings with heightened vigilance. Elizabeth matched his increased alertness, straining her senses for any sign of the potential threat. The valley seemed peaceful, alive with the hum of insects and the occasional call of a bird, yet she now understood how deceptive such tranquility could be. They had traversed perhaps half a mile when Nahilzai halted abruptly, his body tensing, like a bowstring. Elizabeth followed his gaze to a rocky outcropping 50 yards ahead, where 3 figures had materialized as if conjured from the stone itself. Apache warriors, their stance and positioning making it clear this was no chance encounter. They were waiting, Elizabeth whispered, fighting a rising panic. Yes, Nahilze confirmed, his expression unreadable. They knew we would come this way. The Apache warriors made no move to approach, nor did they appear immediately hostile. Their stillness projected patient assessment rather than imminent threat. "What do we do?" Elizabeth asked, unconsciously moving closer to Nahilze. "We meet them," he replied simply. "Running shows fear. Fear invites attack." With that, he walked forward at a measured pace, neither hurried nor tentative. Elizabeth followed, struggling to project a confidence she did not feel. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her posture straight, her gaze steady. If these men were judging her worth, as Nahilze initially had, she would not be found wanting. As they drew closer, Elizabeth could discern more details about the waiting warriors. The eldest, clearly the leader, wore multiple strands of beads and animal teeth, his hair streaked with grey and adorned with a hawk's feather. The younger men flanked him, their expressions impassive, but their eyes alert and evaluating. Nahilze stopped at a respectful distance, raising his hand in what Elizabeth recognized as a greeting gesture. Words followed in the Apache language, musical but guttural, entirely foreign to her ears. The older warrior responded, his gaze shifting between Nahilze and Elizabeth with open curiosity. The exchange continued, occasionally punctuated by gestures toward the canyon behind them or the distant horizon. Though Elizabeth couldn't understand, the words, the tone, suggested tense negotiation rather than outright hostility. Occasionally, Nahilze would indicate her with a brief motion, prompting renewed scrutiny from the other Apache. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the older warrior addressed her directly in heavily accented English. "Why, white woman, walk?" "Apache land," Elizabeth hesitated, glancing at Nahilze, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod of encouragement. "I was abandoned," she replied, deciding honesty was her only viable approach. "Left to die by my brother. Nahilze found me, offered to guide me to safety." The warrior's weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Many white people enter our lands. Few ask permission. All bring trouble." "I don't wish to bring trouble," Elizabeth said earnestly. "I only want to reach the trading post, then continue to Tucson." The older man exchanged words with his companions, before returning his attention to Elizabeth. "Black Horse asks if you are worth the risk Nahilze takes. White soldiers do not like Apache who travel with white women." The question caught Elizabeth off guard. Was she worth the danger Nahilze had assumed by helping her? The uncomfortable truth was that she had never considered the potential consequences for him, the suspicion or hostility he might face from both his own people and from whites who would assume the worst about their association. "I cannot answer that," she said finally, her voice steady despite her turmoil. "Only Nahilze can decide if helping me justifies his risk, but I am grateful beyond words for his aid, and I would never willingly bring harm to him." Her response prompted a lengthy discussion among the Apache men, with Nahilze occasionally contributing. Elizabeth waited, aware that her fate hung in the balance of this incomprehensible conversation. Eventually, the older warrior, Black Horse, addressed her again. "You may pass through our territory, but remember, this land remembers those who walk upon it with respect and those who do not." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, understanding that she had been granted a significant privilege. "I will remember." Black Horse turned to Nahilze, speaking rapidly in Apache once more. Nahilze listened intently, then responded with apparent gratitude. When the exchange concluded, Black Horse extended his hand, offering Elizabeth a small leather pouch For the journey, he explained as she accepted the unexpected gift. Dried corn, pine nuts, dried berries. "I'm honored," Elizabeth said, recognizing the practical value of such provisions in this harsh landscape. With another brief exchange of words with Nahilzai, the three warriors melted back into the landscape as mysteriously as they had appeared, leaving Elizabeth and Nahilzai alone once more. "What happened?" she asked, still processing the encounter. "Why did they let us pass?" Nahilzai began walking again, gesturing for her to follow. "Black Horse knew my father," he explained. "Respects. Family bonds. Also, you spoke the truth. Apache value honest words. They could have killed us," Elizabeth realized, the danger they had faced only now becoming fully apparent. "Yes," Nahilzai agreed matter-of-factly, "but killing brings the U.S. Army more death. Black Horse is wise, sees a larger pattern." Elizabeth considered this pragmatic assessment. "He also warned you, didn't he, about the risk you take helping me?" Nahilzai's pace didn't falter, but something in his posture acknowledged the accuracy of her insight. "All choices have consequences," he said after a moment. "I chose to help. Accept what follows." "Why?" Elizabeth pressed the question that had lingered since their first encounter. Why accept potential danger for a stranger, a white stranger? Nahilzai walked several paces in silence before responding. "3 winters ago, I found a white man in the desert. Prospector, lost when horse died. I left him to fate." His voice remained steady, but Elizabeth sensed the weight behind his words. Later, learned he had a wife, young children. His death caused much suffering. The admission stunned Elizabeth. This, then, was the true reason for his intervention, not mere altruism, but a form of atonement, balancing a past choice he now regretted. "You're trying to right a wrong," she said softly. Nahilzai shook his head slightly. "Not so simple, cannot undo the past. But I can choose differently now." He met her gaze briefly. "Apache believe in harmony, balance. This helps restore." As they continued their journey through the valley, Elizabeth pondered this philosophy, how different from the Christian concepts of her upbringing, with their emphasis on sin and redemption. Nahilzai sought not forgiveness, but balance, a restoration of proper relationship with the world and perhaps with himself. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. They had made good progress, despite the delay with Black Horse, but Nahilzai indicated they would need to find shelter for the night before continuing to the trading post. "Tomorrow we arrive," he said, pointing to distant mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. Trading post beyond those peaks. The promise of returning to civilization by the following day should have filled Elizabeth with unalloyed relief. Instead, her emotions were surprisingly complex. She wanted safety, certainly, food, proper shelter, the company of her own kind. Yet she also recognized that reaching the trading post would mark the end of this strange interlude with Nahilzai, a journey that had transformed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. As if sensing her thoughts, Nahilzai spoke. "Night comes. We make camp there." He indicated a cluster of boulders that would provide shelter from the wind and concealment from prying eyes. They prepared their evening camp with practiced efficiency, falling into the rhythm of shared tasks without need for discussion. Elizabeth gathered edible plants, while Nahilzai scouted the perimeter, ensuring their safety. The easy coordination of their efforts struck Elizabeth as remarkable, given the vast differences in their backgrounds. When darkness fully enveloped the desert, they sat beside a small, carefully shielded fire. The night air carried a chill that made the flame's warmth welcome. Elizabeth opened Black Horse's pouch, sharing its contents with Nahilzai in a gesture that felt significant, though she couldn't have articulated precisely why. "Will you return?" To your people after the trading post, she asked, watching the firelight play across his inscrutable features. Yes, he replied. My band moves soon to winter grounds. Must join them. Elizabeth nodded, trying to imagine the nomadic existence that followed natural rhythms rather than artificial calendars. I wish I could thank them, your people, for the knowledge you've shared with me. It saved my life. Nahilzai studied her across the flames. Knowledge is for using, not thanking. Honor it by remembering, by surviving. I will, Elizabeth promised, the words feeling like a vow. I'll never forget what you've taught me. Something shifted in Nahilzai's typically stoic expression. A softening, perhaps, or a recognition. You learn well, he acknowledged. Adapt quickly. Good traits in changing times. The simple praise warmed Elizabeth more than the fire before them. From this man of few words, such an assessment carried profound weight. As they settled into silence, the stars emerging in brilliant profusion overhead, Elizabeth found herself at a curious peace, despite the dangers that still surrounded them. Vernon and his men might still be searching. The journey tomorrow would likely bring new challenges. The future beyond the trading post remained uncertain at best. Yet in this moment, beneath the vast desert sky, those concerns seemed distant and manageable. She had survived abandonment, exposure, hunger and thirst. She had faced her fears and emerged stronger. Whatever awaited her at the trading post or beyond, she would meet it with the resilience the desert had taught her. Tomorrow would come, with its own demands. For now, the rhythm of Nahilzai's steady breathing across the dying fire and the ancient patterns of stars overhead were enough. Dawn brought a shift in the desert air, a hint of moisture that Nahilzai noticed immediately. He stood at the edge of their camp, head tilted toward the sky, reading patterns invisible to Elizabeth's untrained senses. Storm comes, he announced as she joined him. Bad timing. Elizabeth studied the cloudless blue expanse overhead, seeing no indication of approaching weather. How can you tell? Wind changed direction, smells different. He gestured toward distant mountains, where the faintest darkening could be detected along the peaks. It's raining now, reach us by midday. The prospect of rain, which would have delighted Elizabeth a week ago, now filled her with concern. Will it make travel difficult? Dangerous, Nahilzai corrected. Desert washes fill quickly. Flash floods come without warning. And he hesitated, his expression tightening. Rain washes away our tracks, but also shows new ones clearly. Elizabeth understood the implication. If Vernon and his men were still pursuing them, rain could make their fresh tracks more evident. Against the newly dampened earth. We should leave now, she suggested, already gathering her few possessions. Nahilzai nodded, his usual stoicism tinged with urgency. 8 miles to trading post. Normally arrive by midday. With storm, he shrugged, indicating uncertainty. They set off at a brisk pace, leaving the protection of the boulder cluster that had sheltered them overnight. The terrain changed as they traveled, transitioning from the high-walled valley into more open country where sparse vegetation dotted a landscape of colored stone and undulating sand. Their path followed what appeared to be a dry creek bed, its winding course carved by ancient waters. Flash flood channel, Nahilzai explained, noting Elizabeth's attention to the terrain. When rain comes, water follows this path. We must be far from here by then. The hidden threat beneath the beautiful landscape reminded Elizabeth of a lesson she was learning daily. In the desert, danger and survival existed in precarious balance, often concealed beneath deceptive appearances. As the morning progressed, the distant clouds steadily approached, their initially benign appearance transforming into towering thunderheads that loomed over the mountains. The air grew heavy with anticipation, the distinctive scent of rain on dust reaching them well before the first drops would fall. Nahilzai increased their pace further, occasionally glancing back along their trail. During one such pause, his posture stiffened, his gaze fixed on the horizon behind them. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, her voice hushed with apprehension. "Dust," he replied grimly. "Riders coming fast." Elizabeth followed his indication, barely discerning a faint brown haze against the sky. Vernon or others, 4 men, same as before. Nahilzai's expression was stone. "They found our trail somehow." A chill ran through Elizabeth despite the growing heat of the day. How had they been tracked through the canyon, which Nahilzai had specifically chosen for its inaccessibility to horses? The answer came to her suddenly. "A guide," she said with certainty. "They must have found an Apache guide of their own." Nahilzai's brief nod confirmed her reasoning. "Makes pursuit more dangerous. Native tracker knows desert ways." The dark irony wasn't lost on Elizabeth, that the same cultural knowledge keeping her alive could now be used against her. "How much time do we have?" Nahilzai assessed the distant dust cloud. 1 hour, maybe less. And to the trading post. 3 hours of fast walk. His meaning was clear. They couldn't outpace mounted pursuers on foot, even with their heads start. "Then we need a different strategy," Elizabeth concluded, surprising herself with her clarity under pressure. "What options do we have?" Nahilzai studied her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to evaluate not just her words, but the strength behind them. Whatever he saw apparently satisfied him. "2 choices," he said. "Hide until they pass, then continue. Risky if their tracker is skilled. Or," he paused, considering, "leave the main trail, go through Shadow Canyon, dangerous in the coming storm, but horses cannot follow." "Another canyon like the one yesterday?" Elizabeth asked. "Narrower, deeper, more water." His expression was grave. "Good place to lose pursuers, also a good place to die if a flash flood comes." The decision seemed impossible. Risk capture by remaining on their current path, or risk death by water in the canyon. Elizabeth weighed their options quickly, drawing on her growing understanding of desert realities. "If they catch us, what happens?" she asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "For you, forced return to brother. For me—" Nahilzai made a slight gesture across his throat, the meaning unmistakable. The brutality of this assessment solidified Elizabeth's decision. "Then we take the canyon," she said firmly. "I'd rather risk nature's danger than men's cruelty." Nahilzai nodded once, accepting her choice without further discussion. "This way," he directed, abruptly changing their course to head northeast, away from the main trail toward a distant cleft in the rising terrain. They moved with renewed urgency, the knowledge of pursuit, eliminating any thought of rest or conservation of energy. Elizabeth felt her muscles burn with the effort, but fear proved a powerful motivator. Each time she faltered, the image of Vernon's face, twisted with triumph as he dragged her back to a life of subjugation, drove her forward. The sky continued to darken as they approached the canyon entrance, a narrow fissure in red stone that would have been easy to overlook without Nahilzai's guidance. The air had grown still, the unnatural calm that often precedes violent weather. "Listen," Nahilzai instructed as they paused at the canyon's mouth. "Water sound. If it gets louder suddenly, run to high ground. Don't wait for me." The gravity of his warning struck Elizabeth forcefully. "I won't leave you behind," she countered, the very suggestion unthinkable after all they had endured together. Nahilzai didn't argue, but fixed her with an intent look. "Survival first, always. Promise this." Elizabeth held his gaze, recognizing the gift in his insistence. He was offering her permission to save herself if circumstances demanded it. "I promise to try," she conceded, the most honest answer she could give. They entered the canyon just as the first fat raindrops began to fall, splattering against the red stone and raising small puffs of dust. The passage narrowed immediately, its walls rising sheer on either side to create a corridor barely wide feet across in places. Unlike the previous canyon with its pictographs and occasional vegetation, Shadow Canyon was aptly named. Its depths received little direct sunlight, creating a twilight world of cool air and echoing acoustics. Water already trickled along the canyon floor, a thin rivulet that suggested regular flow even in dry periods. The sound Nahilzai had mentioned was constant but subtle, the distant music of water finding its path downward. Elizabeth kept her senses alert to any change in this background rhythm as they progressed deeper into the shadowed passage. The rain intensified rapidly, the scattered drops becoming a steady downpour that slicked the canyon walls and made the stone path treacherous. Elizabeth followed Nahilzai's example, keeping one hand against the rock face for stability as they navigated around pools of gathering water. "How far through the canyon?" she called over the increasing noise of rainfall. 2 miles, Nahilzai replied, his voice competing with the storm's growing voice. "Halfway to the trading post, but it's slow going." As if to emphasize his point, a section of path ahead disappeared beneath newly formed water, forcing them to press against the canyon wall and edge around the obstacle. The water level was rising visibly now, the initial trickle transforming into a determined stream that tugged at their ankles. The distant water sound suddenly changed, a low rumble replacing the gentler music they had been following. Nahilzai froze, head lifted, listening with intense concentration. "Up," he commanded without preamble, pointing to a narrow ledge about 15 feet above the canyon floor. "Now!" Elizabeth didn't question the urgent directive. She scrambled toward the indicated escape route, Nahilzai close behind. The climb was frantic, handholds slippery with rain, footholds crumbling under pressure. She reached the ledge just as a new sound reached them, a roar like approaching thunder, but continuous and growing louder with terrifying speed. "Flash flood," Nahilzai confirmed, joining her on the ledge that was barely wide enough for both of them. "Stay back against the wall." They pressed themselves into a shallow depression in the rock face as the roar became deafening. Around a bend, in the canyon, surged a wall of water 6 feet high, carrying debris, branches, brush, even small boulders in its churning brown mass. The water slammed into the canyon walls with explosive force, seeking passage through the narrow corridor. Within seconds, the previous path they had followed disappeared completely beneath the raging torrent. Elizabeth watched in horror as the water level continued to rise, now just 8 feet below their precarious perch and still climbing. "Will it reach us?" she shouted over the flood's roar. Nahilzai's expression was taut with calculation. "Depends how much rain upstream. If it rises another 5 feet. He left the consequence unstated, but his meaning was clear. Elizabeth felt strangely calm as she assessed their situation. Death had stalked her since Vernon's abandonment, taking different forms, but remaining a constant companion. If it claimed her now, at least she would meet it on her own terms, fighting for survival rather than surrendering to despair. "If we need to climb higher," she began, scanning the canyon wall above them for possible routes. "Not possible," Nahilzai interrupted, his assessment brutally honest. "Wall too smooth, too wet, this ledge or nothing." They huddled together as the water continued to rise, its surface now churning just 5 feet below them. The rain fell in blinding sheets, making it difficult to gauge how much of the canyon remained above the floodline. The air filled with a fine mist of spray and the sharp scent of wet stone and vegetation. Time stretched in strange ways, minutes feeling like hours as they watched the water level for any sign of change. Elizabeth found herself counting her heartbeats focusing on the steady rhythm rather than the chaos below. 300 beats later, she realized something had shifted. "Look," she said, gripping Nahilzai's arm. "I think it's stopped rising." They observed intently, and indeed, the flood appeared to have reached its peak. The water surface continued to roil with debris, but the level held steady at approximately 4 feet below their position. "Storm passing," Nahilzai noted, pointing. Upstream, where a patch of lighter sky was visible. "Water will drop soon." The reprieve from immediate danger allowed Elizabeth to consider their broader situation. "The men following us? Will they know we came this way?" "If their tracker is good, yes," Nahilzai acknowledged. "But they cannot follow through the canyon, must go around, adds many miles." "So we've gained time," Elizabeth reasoned, hope rekindle. "Yes, if we can continue once water drops." They waited as patiently as their circumstances allowed, watching as the floodwaters gradually subsided. The rain diminished to a gentle patter before ceasing entirely, leaving behind glistening rock faces and puddles that reflected the returning sunlight. After nearly an hour, the water level had dropped enough to reveal portions of their previous path, though the canyon floor remained largely submerged. "We go now," Nahilzai decided, easing himself down from the ledge to test the footing below. "Stay close to wall, step only where I step." Their progress was painfully slow, each footfall requiring careful testing before committing weight. The water continued to push at their legs with surprising force, threatening to sweep them away with any misstep. Elizabeth concentrated on following Nahilzai's exact path, trusting his judgment about which submerged rocks would provide stable support. Halfway through the canyon, they encountered a new obstacle, a section where the flood had completely altered the terrain, washing away their previous route and leaving behind a deep pool with no visible path around its edges. "Must swim," Nahilzai stated, surveying the obstacle. Elizabeth hesitated, eyeing the still turbulent water with apprehension. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. Growing up in Philadelphia, she had never learned to swim, a common omission. For women of her generation and social class, Nahilzai absorbed this information without judgment. "Hold to my shoulder," he instructed. "Keep your feet up, let water carry." Elizabeth nodded, removing her outer skirt to allow greater freedom of movement. The remaining petticoat would provide modest coverage while offering less resistance in the water. She secured Thomas's watch and other small possessions inside her bodice, then approached the water's edge, where Nahilzai waited. With his guidance, she positioned herself alongside him, one hand gripping his shoulder firmly. The initial shock of immersion in the cool water made her gasp, but Nahilzai's steady presence prevented panic. "Breathe steady," he reminded her. "Let the body float. I do work." The crossing was brief but terrifying, the current stronger than Elizabeth had anticipated even from observing its surface. Without Nahilzai's powerful swimming, she would have been swept downstream immediately. As it was, they emerged on the far side several yards below their entry point, Elizabeth sputtering but intact. "Well done," Nahilzai said simply as they dragged themselves onto a relatively dry stone shelf. The unexpected praise warmed Elizabeth despite her sodden condition. "Thank you for not letting me drown," she replied, attempting to wring water from her clothing. They rested briefly to regain strength, before continuing through the canyon's final section, which gradually widened as they progressed. The walls lowered incrementally, allowing more light to penetrate the shadowed passage. When they finally emerged from the canyon's mouth, the contrast was startling. Open desert spread before them, the storm clouds now distant to the east, and the sun reclaiming its dominance in a sky washed clean. Elizabeth turned back to look at the narrow opening they had traversed. "No one would believe what's inside there," she observed. "From here, it looks like nothing special." "Many desert things are this way," Nahilzai replied. "Greatest dangers and treasures often hidden." The philosophical observation struck Elizabeth, as applicable to people as well, herself included. A week ago, she would have appeared to any observer as an ordinary widow, unremarkable and defined by her losses. Now she stood changed, carrying capabilities within that even she hadn't recognized until necessity revealed them. Their path from the canyon led across more open terrain, offering less concealment but easier travel on recovering legs. Elizabeth's clothing dried quickly in the post-storm warmth, the discomfort of damp fabric gradually giving way to the familiar sensation of desert heat against skin. "Trading post is closer now," Nahilzai said, pointing to a distant smudge of green that indicated trees, and thus water and civilization. "Maybe 1 hour." The proximity of their destination brought Elizabeth's thoughts back to the men pursuing them. "Will Vernon guess we're heading for the trading post?" "Yes," Nahilzai confirmed without hesitation. "Only logical destination. Question is whether they reach it before or after us." This sobering assessment heightened Elizabeth's awareness of their vulnerability in this exposed landscape. Without the canyon's protection, they were visible from considerable distance to anyone scanning the horizon. As if prompted by her concern, Nahilzai suddenly dropped into a crouch, gesturing for Elizabeth to do the same. He pointed westward, where a dark line was just visible against the lighter terrain. "Riders," he said grimly. "Moving fast, coming from that direction." He indicated a route that suggested the pursuers had indeed been forced to circumnavigate the canyon, but were now making up for lost time. "Can we reach the trading post before they intercept us?" Elizabeth asked, calculating distances with growing alarm. Nahilzai's expression was grim. "Not possible. They move too quickly." "Then what do we do?" The question contained no panic, only pragmatic focus, another measure of how far she had come from the frightened woman abandoned in the desert. Nahilzai considered their options, his gaze moving between the approaching riders, the distant trading post, and the terrain immediately surrounding them. "One chance," he said finally. "Need help." Before Elizabeth could question his meaning, he pulled a small bone whistle from his pouch, similar to the one she had seen him use days earlier, but with different markings. "Emergency signal," he explained, putting the whistle to his lips and producing a series of rapid, high-pitched notes that carried across the open desert. "Who will hear that?" Elizabeth asked, scanning their surroundings and seeing no sign of potential allies. "Apache always watch trading areas," Nahilzai replied. "Sentinels guard approaches. If we are fortunate, one is near enough to hear." Elizabeth wanted to believe in this potential rescue, but logic insisted on acknowledging their dire situation. The riders would reach them well before they could cover the remaining distance to the trading post, and there was nowhere to hide. In this exposed terrain, if no one comes, she pressed, needing to understand their alternatives, and Nahilzai met her gaze directly. "Then I fight. You run for a trading post." His hand moved to his knife, the gesture both resolute and fatalistic. "I won't leave you to face them alone," Elizabeth insisted, the thought of abandoning him unthinkable after all they had endured together. "May have no choice," he countered, his tone allowing no argument. "Your life matters. My promise to deliver you safely matters more than one Apache." The stark nobility of his position stunned Elizabeth. "Your life matters to me," she said simply, the words emerging before she could consider their implications. Something flickered in Nahilzai's typically stoic expression, surprise perhaps, or an emotion she couldn't name. Before he could respond, a movement caught their attention, not from the direction of the approaching riders, but from a rocky outcropping to the north that Elizabeth had assumed was uninhabited. A figure emerged, then another, and finally a third. Apache warriors on horseback, their appearance so sudden it seemed they had materialized from the desert itself. They approached rapidly, reaching Elizabeth and Nahilzai within minutes. The lead rider, a younger man with sharp features and a scar across his chin, spoke rapidly to Nahilzai in their native tongue. The conversation was brief but intense, punctuated by gestures toward the approaching riders, now close enough for Elizabeth to make out individual figures. "What's happening?" she asked when there was a pause in the exchange. "Swift Hawk offers help," Nahilzai explained. "These are Black Horse's men. They followed us after meeting yesterday, watching from distance." "They've been protecting us?" Elizabeth asked, astonished by this revelation. "Watching," Nahilzai corrected. "Deciding. Now they choose to act." Swift Hawk extended his hand toward Elizabeth, clearly offering her a place on his horse. The other warriors had positioned themselves to face the oncoming threat, rifles ready but not yet raised. "Go with him," Nahilzai directed. "He takes you to trading post. I stay with others to deal with these men." Elizabeth hesitated, torn between the chance for immediate safety and reluctance to be separated from the man who had become her lifeline. "In this hostile wilderness. Will I see you again?" she asked, the question revealing more of her feelings than she had intended. "If path allows," he replied, his usual reserve softened by something that might have been regret. "Now go, quickly." With Swift Hawk's assistance, Elizabeth mounted behind him, the unfamiliar position, both precarious and secure. As the horse wheeled toward the trading post, she looked back at Nahilzai, committing his figure to memory, straight-backed and resolute, beside his newfound allies, facing the approaching danger without hesitation. "Thank you," she called, the words inadequate but heartfelt. Whether he heard or not, she couldn't tell. Swift Hawk's horse leapt forward, carrying her towards safety at a gallop, while the confrontation between pursuers and defenders receded behind them. As the distance grew, Elizabeth heard a single rifle shot echo across the desert, then another. Then silence. The trading post appeared on the horizon as a cluster of low buildings surrounded by cottonwoods, a mirage of civilization amid the wilderness. Swift Hawk's horse thundered across the final stretch of desert, dust billowing behind them as they approached the outpost. Elizabeth clung to the warrior's back, her mind racing between hope for safety ahead and fear for what she had left behind. The distant gunshots still echoed in her memory. Had Nahilzai survived the confrontation, or had he fallen defending her escape? The uncertainty gnawed at her with each passing moment. The trading post grew larger as they approached, a main building of adobe brick with a wide porch, several outbuildings, and a corral containing horses and mules. A water trough and hitching post stood out front, currently unoccupied. No other riders or wagons were visible, suggesting limited current business at this remote outpost. Swift Hawk slowed his horse as they reached the yard, approaching cautiously rather than charging directly to the hitching post. Elizabeth understood. His wariness. Apache were not universally welcomed at white establishments, regardless of their intentions. A man emerged onto the porch, tall and weathered, with a grey-streaked beard and clothing that had seen better days. He carried a shotgun, not pointed at them but ready in his hands, as he assessed the unexpected arrivals. "That's far enough," he called, his voice carrying the gravelled quality of someone who spent considerable time alone. Swift Hawk halted his horse at a respectful distance. "Women needs help," he said, in accented but clear English. "Men follow, bad men." The trader's attention shifted to Elizabeth, his expression changing from suspicion to concern as he took in her dishevelled appearance and the obvious signs of her ordeal. "Ma'am?" he inquired, the single word conveying multiple questions. Elizabeth gathered her composure. "My name is Elizabeth Mason. I was abandoned in the desert days ago by my half-brother. These Apache saved my life. Men are pursuing us, my brother and hired guns. They mean to take me by force." The trader absorbed this information, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. After a moment's consideration, he lowered his shotgun slightly. "James Holbrook," he introduced himself with a curt nod. "Run this place for 15 years. Don't care much for family squabbles, but I don't abide forcing women against their will either." He jerked his head toward the main building. "Better come inside." Swifthawk helped Elizabeth dismount, her legs unsteady after the hard ride. Before she could thank him, the Apache warrior turned his horse back toward the desert. "Wait," Elizabeth called, catching his sleeve. "Nahilzai, is he—" Swifthawk's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a glimmer of understanding. "I go now. Help him if needed." With that terse explanation, he spurred his horse and galloped back in the direction they had come. Holbrook watched the departing warrior with a mixture of respect and wariness. "Friend of yours?" he asked Elizabeth, the question loaded with unspoken implications. "He saved my life," she replied simply, the statement both answer and defense. Titi, trader nodded, accepting this at face value. "Come on in before those men of yours show up. Sounds like we need to sort a few things out." Elizabeth followed Holbrook into the trading post, the interior dimly lit but mercifully cool after the desert heat. The main room served multiple functions: general store, meeting place, and apparently Holbrook's living quarters, with a small bed visible in one corner behind a partial screen. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with necessities: canned goods, flour, coffee, ammunition, tools, and fabric. A pot-bellied stove occupied the center of the room, currently cold in the summer heat, but obviously the heart of the establishment during winter months. A scarred wooden counter separated the public area from Holbrook's private domain. "Sit," the trader directed, indicating a wooden chair near the counter. "You look about done in." Elizabeth sank gratefully into the seat, her body suddenly acknowledging the accumulated exhaustion of days of survival and flight. Holbrook disappeared briefly behind a curtained doorway, returning with a cup of water that he placed before her. "Drink. Slow," he advised. "Then tell me what's going on." Elizabeth sipped the water, organizing her thoughts. This man represented her first contact with her own society after days in the wilderness. His response to her story could determine her immediate future, whether she found sanctuary or faced renewed danger. "My husband Thomas died 6 months ago," she began, deciding that context was necessary. "My half-brother Vernon offered to escort me to California for a fresh start. 3 days ago, he abandoned me in the desert, taking all our supplies except a nearly empty canteen. He wanted my wedding ring, the only valuable I had left, and likely planned to report me dead when he reached California." Holbrook's expression darkened as she spoke, his hands unconsciously tightening on the counter edge. "Man does that to his own kin. He's lower than a rattler's belly," he commented when she paused. "An Apache named Nahilzai found me," Elizabeth continued. "He could have left me to die, many would have, but instead he gave me food, water, medicine for my sunburn. He offered to guide me here, where I might find help reaching Tucson." "This Nahilzai," Holbrook interrupted, "he expect payment for this help?" The question carried insinuations that made Elizabeth bristle. "He asked for nothing," she said firmly. "He helped because it was the right thing to do, something my own brother couldn't manage." Holbrook raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Just asking. Seen all kinds out here, good and bad in every skin color." He paused, considering. "So your brother and these men, they're tracking you to what end?" "Vernon told them I was kidnapped," Elizabeth explained, the bitter irony still fresh. "He's offering a reward for my rescue, plus my marriage to Daniel Thompson, a store owner's son in Willow Bend. I overheard them discussing it when they were searching for me." "Selling you twice over," Holbrook observed grimly. "To these fellas for the reward, then to Thompson for whatever arrangement they cooked up." He shook his head in disgust. "Some men deserve what they get out here." The statement hung in the air, its implications clear enough without elaboration. Elizabeth thought again of the gunshots she had heard, wondering if Vernon had indeed gotten what he deserved. "What will you do when they arrive?" she asked, the question unavoidable. Holbrook stroked his beard, weighing options. Trading posts supposed to be neutral ground. Apache, white settlers, Mexican traders, all welcome to do business peacefully. He glanced toward the shotgun he had leaned against the counter. "But I got no patience for men who abandon women in the desert or try to force them into unwanted arrangements." A spark of hope kindled in Elizabeth's chest. This gruff trader might prove an unexpected ally in her quest for autonomy. "Is there a law officer nearby?" she asked. "Someone who might intervene officially?" Holbrook's bark of laughter held little humor. "Nearest marshal's in Tucson, good 2 days' ride from here. Out this far, ma'am, folks mostly make their own justice." He studied her with shrewd assessment. "But I'm thinking you already learned something about that these past few days." Before Elizabeth could respond, hoofbeats sounded outside, multiple riders approaching at speed. Holbrook moved to the window, peering through the dusty glass. "3 riders," he reported, "coming in hard. One looks injured." Elizabeth joined him at the window, her heart leaping into her throat. Through the warped glass, she could make out 3 mounted figures, 2 Apache warriors she recognized from Black Horse's band, and between them, slumped forward, but clearly alive, Nahilzai. "Open the door," she urged Holbrook, already moving toward the entrance. "Please, they're friends." The trader hesitated only briefly before unbarring the heavy wooden door. Elizabeth rushed onto the porch as the riders reached the hitching post. Nahilzai's shirt was stained with blood on one side, his normally impassive face drawn with pain, but his eyes found hers immediately. "You're hurt," she said, the words emerging as both accusation and relief as she helped him dismount. "Bullet grazed," he replied, his voice strained but steady, not serious. The other warriors remained mounted, clearly unwilling to enter the white man's establishment. One spoke rapidly to Nahilzai, who nodded and replied in their shared language. The exchange was brief but appeared significant. "What happened?" Elizabeth asked, as the warriors turned their horses and departed as swiftly as they had arrived. Nahilzai straightened with effort, one hand pressed to his bleeding side. "Vernon dead," he stated without emotion. "Shot by own man in confusion. Others fled." The news struck Elizabeth with unexpected force. Vernon, her last blood relative, the brother who had betrayed her so completely, was dead. She searched her heart for grief or regret, but found only a hollow sense of closure. "Come inside," she said after a moment. "Your wound needs tending." Holbrook had watched the exchange from the doorway, his expression unreadable. As Elizabeth guided Nahilzai toward the porch, the trader stepped aside to allow them entry, though his posture remained wary. "He needs help," Elizabeth stated, making it clear this was not a request. Holbrook assessed the wounded Apache with practiced eyes. "Bullet wound, grazed his side," Elizabeth confirmed. "Do you have medical supplies?" The trader nodded toward the back room. "Through there. Got a cot and a kit. Used to be an army medic before I took up trading." This unexpected revelation shifted Elizabeth's perception of the gruff man. With Holbrook's assistance, they helped Nahilzai to the indicated room, where a narrow cot stood against one wall. The space was sparsely furnished but clean, apparently serving as a storeroom and occasional infirmary. "Need to see the wound," Holbrook said, professional demeanor replacing his earlier suspicion. Nahilzai eyed the trader with understandable wariness, but allowed Elizabeth to help remove his bloodied shirt. The injury was, as he had described, a deep graze along his right side that had torn flesh but appeared to have missed vital organs. Holbrook examined the wound with clinical detachment. "Clean shot. Needs washing, stitching, and bandaging." He retrieved a wooden box from a shelf, opening it to reveal surprisingly well-organized medical supplies. "I'll need hot water," he told Elizabeth, already threading a curved needle. Elizabeth found a kettle and stove in an adjoining lean-to kitchen, where she quickly heated water. As she worked, her mind processed the rapid developments of the past. Arrival at the trading post, Vernon's death, Nahilzai's injury. The desert's brutal efficiency in resolving conflicts struck her again. No protracted legal battles or social maneuvering here, just immediate, irreversible consequences. When she returned with the hot water, Holbrook had prepared his supplies and was explaining the procedure to Nahilzai in simple terms. "Going to hurt," he concluded frankly. "No way around that." Nahilzai nodded once, his expression stoic. "Not the first bullet," he replied with grim humor. Elizabeth positioned herself at Nahilzai's uninjured side, offering her hand without comment. After a moment's hesitation, he accepted the support, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers with surprising gentleness. Holbrook worked efficiently, first cleaning the wound with a carbolic solution that made Nahilzai's grip tighten painfully. On Elizabeth's hand, though he made no sound, the stitching that followed was neat and precise, evidence of the trader's claimed medical background. Throughout the procedure, Nahilzai remained silent, his only reactions the occasional tightening of his jaw or quickening of breath. When Holbrook finished bandaging the wound, he stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Should heal clean if infection doesn't set in," he assessed. "Need to rest at least a day before traveling." "Thank you," Elizabeth said sincerely, recognizing the significance of the trader's assistance to an Apache when many whites would have refused. Holbrook shrugged, his professional manner receding now that the medical emergency had passed. "Got questions that need answering," he said, addressing Nahilzai directly. "What happened out there with those men?" Nahilzai met the trader's gaze steadily. "They attacked. We defended. Simple." "And the brother?" Holbrook pressed. "Shot by own man when horses spooked," Nahilzai explained, the sparse details revealing little of the actual confrontation. "Bullet meant for me found him instead." Elizabeth could fill in the blanks from her knowledge of Vernon. He had likely been shouting orders, positioning himself prominently, perhaps even using his men as shields. The chaos of a desert gunfight would have made him an easy accidental target. "Other men," Holbrook continued his questioning. "Ran when the leader fell," Nahilzai replied. "Not their fight anymore without payment." The trader nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. "Army patrol comes through here every few weeks," he mentioned casually. "If they ask questions about dead men in the desert." "Nothing to tell," Nahilzai stated, the implication clear. "No bodies remain to be found." The reality of desert justice was stark, but Elizabeth found herself unable to muster moral outrage. Vernon had abandoned her to die. His hired guns had pursued her with intent to capture or kill. The outcome, while brutal, carried a certain harsh fairness. "You need rest," she told Nahilzai, noticing his increasing pallor. "We can discuss the future later." For once, he didn't argue, allowing Elizabeth and Holbrook to help him lie back on the cot. Within minutes, exhaustion and blood loss claimed him, his breathing deepening into sleep. Elizabeth returned to the main room with Holbrook, who poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot kept warm on the stove. He handed one to her without asking. If she wanted it, the gesture somehow both presumptuous and considerate. "So," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "What now?" The question caught Elizabeth off guard, though it shouldn't have. With Vernon dead and immediate danger past, she needed to determine her next steps. The familiar weight of uncertainty settled on her shoulders, but it felt different now. A challenge rather than a burden. "I still intend to reach Tucson," she said after a moment's reflection. "From there, perhaps continue to California as originally planned." Holbrook nodded thoughtfully. Stage comes through every 2 weeks. Next one is due in 3 days. Can arrange passage for you. He hesitated, glancing toward the back room where Nahilzai slept. Your Apache friend, he have plans? The question stirred emotions Elizabeth wasn't prepared to examine. He mentioned returning to his people, she said, striving for neutrality. Their band moves to winter grounds soon, most Apache heading into the mountains this time of year, Holbrook confirmed. Game's better there and they can avoid army patrols. He studied Elizabeth over the rim of his coffee cup. Unusual friendship you've formed. The word friendship seemed simultaneously inadequate and presumptuous for what had developed between her and Nahilzai. How could conventional terms capture a bond forged through shared survival, mutual protection, and life-or-death decisions? He saved my life, she said simply, several times over. Holbrook's weathered face softened slightly. Been out here for 15 years, seen all kinds of hatred between whites and natives, also seen rare moments of understanding. He set his cup down deliberately. Those connections matter more than most folks realize. The observation surprised Elizabeth, revealing deeper currents beneath the trader's gruff exterior. You sound like you speak from experience. A shadow crossed Holbrook's features. Wife was half Mexican, half Yaqui, he said after a pause. Lost her to fever 5 years back. Learned plenty about living between worlds from her. This personal revelation explained much about the trader's willingness to help both Elizabeth and Nahilzai without the prejudice common to frontier settlements. I'm sorry for your loss, she offered, the condolence sincere. Holbrook acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod before changing the subject. Trading posts got a small room off the kitchen, he said. Nothing fancy, but clean. You can use it until the stage comes. No charge. Thank you, Elizabeth replied, touched by the unexpected generosity. I have little money, but I can work for my keep. Could use help with inventory, Holbrook allowed. The suggestion clearly meant to preserve her dignity rather than exploit her situation. And there's mending that's piled up since Sarah passed. The arrangement settled, Elizabeth allowed herself to relax slightly for the first time in days. The trading post wasn't permanent safety, but it offered a reprieve, a place to recover, and plan without the constant threat of death from elements or pursuers. As evening approached, she checked on Nahilzai, finding him awake and alert despite his injury. He watched her enter with those unreadable dark eyes that had initially frightened her, but now represented security. "How are you feeling?" she asked, noting his improved color. "Better," he replied, attempting to sit up and wincing with the effort. Elizabeth moved to assist him, arranging blankets to support his back against the wall. "Holbrook says the stage to Tucson comes in 3 days, she informed him, keeping her tone casual, though the information felt momentous. "I've arranged the passage." Nahilzai nodded once, accepting this development without visible reaction. "Good. Tucson is safer for you. And you?" Elizabeth asked, the question hanging between them laden with unspoken complexities. "What will you do when you're healed?" "Return to my people," he said. The answer expected, but still disappointing somehow. "They move to winter grounds in the mountains soon. Need every hunter." Elizabeth nodded, fighting an irrational sense of loss. Of course he would return to his band, his culture, his family, his way of life. The notion that their paths might continue together was fantasy born of shared danger, not practical reality. "I owe you my life," she said quietly. "I don't know how to repay such a debt." Nahilzai's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "No debt between us," he replied. "You fought for your life. I only showed the way." "You did far more than that." Elizabeth insisted, unwilling to let him diminish his role in her survival. "You fed me, protected me, taught me. You risked your life against those men." A faint smile touched his lips. "You learn quickly. Good student. The praise warmed her despite its simplicity. "Desert changes those who survive it," he continued, his gaze holding hers. "You are not the same woman who was abandoned. Stronger. Now, see more clearly." The assessment resonated deeply. Elizabeth indeed felt transformed by her ordeal, more capable, more discerning, less constrained by social expectations. The desert had stripped away pretense and pretension, leaving only her essential self. "I won't forget what you taught me," she promised. "Not just how to survive, but how to see the world differently." Nahilzai nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good. Take these lessons to your new life." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. Perhaps one day paths cross again. The possibility, however remote, lifted Elizabeth's spirits. "I would like that," she admitted, the sentiment honest if improbable. They sat in companionable silence as dusk deepened. Outside the small window, the desert transitioning from day's harsh clarity to night's mysterious shadows. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, but for now, this moment of connection was enough. Two people from vastly different worlds, united by shared experience and mutual respect. The confrontation with Vernon and his men was over, but Elizabeth sensed that a more personal confrontation lay ahead, with her own preconceptions, with society's expectations, with the uncertain future stretching before her. Whatever challenges awaited, she would face them with the strength the desert had taught her, carrying Nahilzai's wisdom as guidance for the journey ahead. 3 days passed at the trading post, each bringing subtle but significant changes. Elizabeth's sunburned skin began to heal, the angry redness fading to a golden tan that spoke of her desert journey. Her hands, once soft with city living, remained calloused, badges of survival she wore with quiet pride rather than dismay. The reflection that greeted her in Holbrook's small mirror belonged to a stranger, leaner, weathered, with eyes that held a depth absent in the pampered Philadelphia widow who had begun this journey months ago. Nahilzai recovered with remarkable speed, the wound in his side closing cleanly under Holbrook's surprisingly skilled care. By the second day, he moved about the trading post with minimal discomfort, his natural grace returning as pain subsided. He spent hours observing the trading post's operation, studying the interactions between Holbrook and the occasional customers. Mexican, traders, white settlers, and even a small band of Pima Indians who arrived to exchange pottery and woven baskets for coffee and ammunition. "He's curious about everything," Holbrook commented to Elizabeth as they watched Nahilzai examining a newly arrived shipment of goods. "Most Apache I've met keep to themselves, speak only when necessary. Your friend there, he's different." "He spent time at an army school," Elizabeth explained, recalling what little Nahilzai had shared of his past. "I think he sees value in understanding both worlds." The trader nodded thoughtfully. "Rare quality, that. Could keep him alive when others fall." He hesitated, then added, "Could be dangerous too. Man who stands between worlds is often trusted by neither." The observation lingered with Elizabeth as she settled into a temporary routine, helping Holbrook with inventory during mornings and mending neglected linens and clothing in the afternoons. The simple domestic tasks felt strange after. Her desert ordeal, almost trivial compared to the life-or-death challenges she had faced. Yet she found comfort in their normalcy, a bridge between her former life and whatever awaited her in Tucson. During quiet moments, Elizabeth recorded her experiences in a journal purchased from Holbrook's Supplies, the act of setting words to paper helping to organize the tumultuous emotions and revelations of recent days. The woman who had embarked on the journey west with Vernon bore little resemblance to the one who now filled these pages with clear-eyed observations and hard-won wisdom. "I am not who I was," she wrote one evening. "The desert stripped away pretense and pride, leaving only essential truths. I know now what I can endure, what I can overcome. No man will ever again determine my worth or my fate." On the second evening, a wagon train passed through, 3 families heading to California, stopping to replenish supplies and exchange news. Elizabeth observed their interactions with fascination, noting how quickly the travelers categorized her in ways that no longer fit. The women offered sympathetic glances, assuming her a widow or abandoned wife in need of protection. The men assessed her as potential property, their evaluations transparent in their gazes. "Poor dear," one matron whispered loudly enough for Elizabeth to overhear. "All alone out here. Perhaps she could join our party. The Wilsons lost their cook at the last settlement." The suggestion, well-intentioned but condescending, would have seemed reasonable to Elizabeth 6 months ago. Now it struck her as absurd. She was no helpless creature to be collected and assigned value based on domestic services. She had survived the desert's merciless judgment. These travelers' assessments held no power over her. Nahilze noticed her reaction, a barely perceptible smile touching his lips as he caught her eye across the room. Without words, their shared glance acknowledged the irony. These self-proclaimed civilized people seeing only a fraction of who she truly was. On the evening before the stage was due to arrive, Elizabeth sat on the trading post's porch, watching. The sunset painted the desert in shades of amber and gold. The view that once would have seemed desolate now revealed intricate beauty. The subtle variations in terrain, the hardy plants sustaining life against impossible odds, the grand sweep of sky meeting earth at the distant horizon. Coyotes called. In the gathering twilight, their yipping chorus, a reminder of wilderness persisting at civilization's edges. Nahilze joined her, his movement nearly silent even on the wooden planks. He carried something wrapped in a scrap of buckskin, which he placed beside her before sitting down. "For your journey," he said simply. Elizabeth unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a knife, smaller than his, but perfectly balanced, with a bone handle carved in intricate patterns resembling flowing water. "It's beautiful," she said, testing its weight in her palm. "Practical," he corrected, though his eyes acknowledged her appreciation of its craftsmanship. Desert women need proper tool. The designation, Desert Woman, filled Elizabeth with unexpected warmth. No longer the helpless city dweller abandoned to die, she had earned this new identity through struggle and adaptation. "The pattern?" she asked, tracing the flowing design with her fingertip. "Does it have meaning?" Nahilze nodded, his expression softening as he explained. "Water pattern, most precious desert gift, follows the path of least resistance, yet over time shapes even the hardest stone." He regarded her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond surfaces, "like you." The comparison stunned Elizabeth with its unexpected poetry. This man, so economical with words, had captured her transformation with perfect metaphorical precision. "Thank you," she said, tucking the knife into the pocket of her newly acquired skirt, practical clothing purchased from Holbrook's limited stock. "I have something for you as well." From her own pocket, she withdrew Thomas's pocket watch. The gold case caught the fading sunlight, its surface scratched but still gleaming. She held it out to Nahilze, who made no move to accept it. "This was your husband's," he observed, his tone questioning. "Yes," Elizabeth confirmed, "my last connection to him. But now—" She paused, organizing her thoughts. "Now I carry him in memory, not objects. And I carry a debt to you that can never be repaid with mere things." Nahilze studied the watch, then met her gaze directly. "No debt between us," he repeated his earlier assertion. "But if giving this brings peace to your heart, I accept." He took the watch carefully, examining its mechanism with genuine interest. The image struck Elizabeth forcefully. this man of the desert holding a timepiece designed to fragment days into rigid segments, a concept so foreign to his natural rhythms. "White man's son," he commented with faint amusement, returning the watch to its case. "Always running, never still." "Perhaps that's our problem," Elizabeth mused. "Always rushing forward instead of being present in the moment." Nahilzai's expression indicated agreement. Apache see time differently. Season follows season. Sun follows the moon. No need for a metal circle to tell what eyes already know. "Yet you accept the watch," Elizabeth observed, curious about the seeming contradiction. "Different ways can exist together," he replied after a thoughtful pause. "Apache way values what works, what survives. Watch survives, has a purpose." His lips curved slightly. "Also beautiful. Beauty has its own purpose." The philosophical exchange fell into comfortable silence as they watched the sunset complete its magnificent display. Stars emerged in the deepening blue, their brilliance undiminished by city lights or coal smoke. Elizabeth had never truly seen stars until her desert journey, one of countless revelations the wilderness had granted her. A shooting star streaked across the heavens, its brief incandescence drawing both their gazes upward. "Good sign," Nahilzai commented. "Spirit messenger." "What message does it bring?" Elizabeth asked, finding herself open to interpretations she would have dismissed as superstition weeks earlier. "Different for each who sees," he replied. "What did you feel when light crossed the sky?" Elizabeth considered the question honestly. "Hope," she said finally, "that even brief connections leave traces behind." Nahilzai nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Then that is your message. Tomorrow you begin a new path," he observed after a time. "Yes," Elizabeth acknowledged, emotions tangled at the prospect. "Tucson first, then perhaps California as originally planned." "What will you do there?" he asked, the rare personal question, revealing genuine interest. Elizabeth had been considering this very question during her days at the trading post. "I have some skills: reading, writing, basic accounting. Thomas taught me bookkeeping for his mining interests." She straightened slightly, resolution forming. "I won't marry again for security or social standing. I'll make my own way." Nahilzai nodded, approval evident in his expression. "Good plan. Strong woman needs no master." The simple validation meant more coming from him than elaborate praise from others might have. Nahilzai dealt only in truth as he perceived it. No flattery, no social niceties, no hidden agendas. "And you," Elizabeth asked, "will your people welcome you back after helping me?" He considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "Some will understand, others will question, but I am still Apache, still hunter, still warrior." His gaze turned toward the mountains, visible as dark shapes against the star-filled sky. "Winter camps need every strong arm. They will accept what is done, and the risks you took, the wound you suffered," Elizabeth pressed, guilt surfacing at the thought of consequences he might face for aiding her. "Life is at risk," he replied with a slight shrug. "Wound heals, story remains." He touched the bandaged area at his side. "This will become a tale told around fires, how Nahilzai fought white men to save desert woman." A rare smile touched his features. "Good story, worth the wound." A lantern flared in the trading post window. Holbrook's signal that evening meal was prepared. Neither Elizabeth nor Nahilzai moved immediately, reluctant to end this moment of connection on the threshold of parting. "I've been thinking about what you said, about paths crossing again," Elizabeth said finally. "Would your people allow a visitor, someone who wanted to learn more of their ways?" The question clearly surprised Nahilzai, his typically unreadable expression opening briefly to reveal genuine astonishment. "White woman visit Apache camp?" Unusual. He studied her with renewed intensity. But you, not the usual white woman. Is it possible? She pressed, unwilling to relinquish the possibility entirely. Difficult, he admitted. Army watches, agents restrict movement, but... He paused, seeming to make a decision. Spring brings a trade meeting. Apache, Navajo, some trusted whites, near Painted Rocks. If you were there... The suggestion hung between them, tenuous but real, a potential future encounter in a world that typically kept their peoples strictly separated. I'll find a way, Elizabeth promised, the prospect already taking root in her imagination. What month? When desert blooms, Nahilzai replied. April, perhaps May, depends on rains. Elizabeth committed the information to memory, already calculating what would be required to position herself in the vicinity during that period. And Painted Rocks, where exactly is that? Northwest of Tucson. Ask at trading houses. Some know a place. His expression grew serious. But speak carefully. Not. All whites are welcome at such meetings. The implicit trust in sharing this information was not lost on Elizabeth. I understand, she said simply. I won't betray your confidence. The following morning dawned clear and cool, the desert offering perfect weather for travel. Holbrook had prepared provisions for both departing guests, trail rations for Nahilzai's journey to his people's winter camp, and a small travel bag with necessities for Elizabeth's stage journey to Tucson. Stage'll be here by noon, the trader informed them as they shared a final breakfast. Usually stays just long enough to change horses and take on mail. Elizabeth nodded, suddenly anxious about rejoining the flow of civilization after her transformative detour. The prospect of other passengers, social expectations, and the coming urban environment of Tucson seemed strangely daunting after the desert's primal simplicity. When you reach Tucson, Holbrook continued, seek out Margaret Sullivan at the Sonoran Hotel. Tell her James sent you. He noticed Elizabeth's questioning look and elaborated, she's a good woman, runs the place fair and straight, might have to work for someone with your skills. Thank you, Elizabeth replied, touched by this unexpected assistance. You've been more than kind, Holbrook shrugged off her gratitude. Desert teaches quick judgment of character. You've got quality, both of you. He included Nahilzai in his assessment, an equality of regard rare among frontier settlers. Nahilzai prepared to depart earlier, his recuperation sufficient for the journey to his people. He dressed in his original clothing, now mended by Elizabeth's hand, the only addition being Thomas's watch, secured carefully in a small pouch at his waist. Their farewell took place away from Holbrook's watchful eye, at the edge of the trading post property where desert reclaimed dominance from human settlement. This is where our paths divide, Nahilzai said, his normally stoic demeanor softened by what might have been regret. For now, Elizabeth amended, refusing to accept permanence in their separation. I meant what I said about the spring trading. Meeting? He nodded, acknowledging her determination without false assurances. If you come, ask for Morning Star's band, my mother's family. The personal detail, one of very few he had shared, struck Elizabeth as a significant parting gift. I will, she promised. They stood facing each other, cultural norms providing no script for this unprecedented farewell. After a moment's hesitation, Elizabeth extended her hand as she might to any valued acquaintance. Nahilzai regarded the gesture, briefly before accepting it, his calloused palm warm against hers. May your path be clear, he said formally, then added in a softer tone, Desert woman. And yours, my friend, Elizabeth replied, infusing the simple address with all the gratitude and respect she couldn't adequately express. With a final nod, Nahilzai turned and walked into the desert, his figure soon blending with the landscape that had nearly claimed Elizabeth's life and instead had transformed it completely. She watched until he disappeared entirely, the emptiness left by his absence a physical sensation she hadn't anticipated. When the stagecoach arrived hours later, a cloud of dust resolving into a weather-beaten vehicle drawn by 6 horses, Elizabeth, boarded with mixed emotions. The other passengers, a merchant couple and a young army lieutenant, regarded her with curious glances but little conversation as the coach lurched into motion. "Heading to Tucson, ma'am?" the lieutenant finally inquired, breaking the awkward silence. "Yes," Elizabeth replied, offering no elaboration that might invite unwanted questions about her circumstances. "Family there?" the merchant's wife asked, her tone suggesting this was the only acceptable reason for a woman to travel alone. Elizabeth met the woman's gaze directly. "No," she said. "Business opportunities." The deliberate vagueness of her response discouraged further prying, and conversation soon turned to safer topics: the weather, road conditions, the political climate in Tucson. As the trading post receded, behind them, Elizabeth turned her gaze forward, toward Tucson and beyond. Vernon was dead. Her old life had ended in the desert. What remained was the woman she had become, stronger, wiser, unbound by convention or others' expectations. The stagecoach crossed a dry wash where recent rain had left temporary pools reflecting the sky. Elizabeth recalled Nahilzai's words about flash floods, about reading the land's warnings before disaster struck. She found herself automatically assessing the terrain as he had taught her, noting the subtle signs of water's passage, the variety of plant life indicating soil conditions, the distant formations that might offer shelter in an emergency. These skills, once crucial for survival, would serve different purposes in her new life. The ability to read situations, to assess threats and opportunities, to act decisively rather than react emotionally. These were valuable in any environment, civilized or wild. Her hand found the knife in her pocket, its solid presence a reminder of all she had endured and learned. The desert had intended to be her grave, but instead had become her crucible, burning away weakness and leaving behind something tempered and true. As afternoon light slanted across the landscape, the stagecoach passed a solitary rider heading west, an Apache warrior, though not Nahilzai or any of Black Horse's band. The warrior and Elizabeth exchanged brief glances as their paths crossed, and she found herself nodding in silent acknowledgement. The rider returned the gesture, surprise evident in his expression before the coach carried her onward. That small moment of recognition confirmed Elizabeth's inner transformation more powerfully than any mirror reflection. The Apache had seen her not as a white woman to be feared or avoided, but as a fellow traveler in this harsh land, worthy of basic respect. The exchange would have been impossible for the woman who had begun this journey months ago. The lieutenant had observed the interaction, his expression betraying curiosity and faint disapproval. "You seem familiar with the natives, ma'am," he commented, the observation bordering on accusation. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "I've learned that people are individuals, Lieutenant, regardless of their origins. Some act with honor, others with cruelty. Skin color predicts neither." The young officer appeared taken aback by her forthright response, but something in her demeanor discouraged argument. The merchant's wife shifted uncomfortably, but her husband nodded slightly, perhaps recognizing wisdom born of experience. The conversation drifted to safer topics as the coach continued its journey, but Elizabeth found herself increasingly withdrawn from the social dynamics unfolding around her. These people, well-meaning but confined by their cultural assumptions, seemed to inhabit a different world than the one she had discovered in the desert's crucible. As dusk approached, the first distant lights of outlying ranches appeared on the horizon, harbingers of Tucson beyond. Elizabeth felt a curious detachment watching civilization gradually reclaim the landscape. fences sectioning the once boundless terrain, cultivated fields imposing geometric order on natural chaos, houses standing defiant against the elements rather than working in harmony with them. The stagecoach rocked across the terrain, following established trails toward town. But Elizabeth Mason, once abandoned and left to die, carried the wilderness within her now, its harsh lessons, its desperate beauty, and the unexpected connection it had forged with a man from a world apart from her own. Spring would come. The desert would bloom briefly, brilliantly, and perhaps at Painted Rocks, two paths that logic said should never have crossed would find their way to intersection once more. Until then, she was Desert Woman, survivor, adapter, author of her own destiny, and that identity, hard-won and precious, would guide her journey forward, wherever it might lead. As Tucson's lights grew stronger against the gathering darkness, Elizabeth made a silent vow. She would build a new life here, independent, purposeful, authentically her own. She would find her way to Painted Rocks when the desert bloomed. And someday, when the time was right, she would record this journey not as a tale of victimhood and rescue, but as a testament to human resilience and the unexpected bridges that can form between worlds society insists must remain separate. The stagecoach rattled toward its destination, carrying Elizabeth toward a future unwritten, open to possibilities as vast as the desert itself. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.